June 6, 1984, Normandy, France. Two old men stood face to face on a beach where the sand had once turned red with blood. One was American, 72 years old. His name was Marcus Flynn, and 40 years ago he had led men through hell on this very stretch of coastline. The other was German, 74 years old. His name was Heinrich Vogel, and 40 years ago he had tried to kill every American who set foot on this sand. Now they were both crying. The French families on the beach that summer day stopped and stared at the two elderly men. The children building sandcastles looked up at their parents, confused by what they were seeing. Two grandfathers, one in an American veteran's cap and one speaking with a thick German accent, standing where the waves touched the shore with tears streaming down their weathered faces. Then the German did something no one expected. He opened his arms and embraced the American, and the American embraced him back. They held each other for a long moment. Two former enemies, two men who had once tried to kill each other, two survivors of the same nightmare standing in the same place where that nightmare had unfolded 4 decades earlier. When they finally stepped apart, the German spoke in English that still carried the accent of Bavaria. That day he said, his voice trembling, "You gave me something more precious than my life. You gave me back my humanity." The American could only shake his head, his own voice breaking. "And you gave me a reason to believe that war does not always turn men into monsters." What had happened between these two men? What moment on this beach in 1904 had transformed sworn enemies into something closer than brothers? The answer begins with 47 minutes, the most extraordinary 47 minutes in military history. The 47 minutes when a group of American soldiers, everyone called failures, did something the entire world believed was impossible. But to understand how impossible it truly was, you need to go back to the beginning. Back to a morning when the fate of the free world hung in the balance. Back to a time when these two old men were young and terrified and certain they would never see another sunrise. Southwick House, Portsmouth, England, 9:30 a.m., June 6, 1944. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower stood in the map room with his hands clasped behind his back. The clock on the wall ticked with a sound that seemed louder than the chaos surrounding him. His face was gray with exhaustion. He had not slept in 2 days. All around him, officers rushed back and forth with papers and radio reports. Telephones rang constantly. Voices shouted coordinates and casualty figures. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the sharp smell of coffee that had been brewing since before dawn. The biggest military invasion in human history was happening at this very moment. 156,000 Allied soldiers were crossing the English Channel. They came in 5,000 ships. They were protected by 11,000 airplanes. This was D-Day. This was the operation that would decide the outcome of World War II, and Eisenhower was the man responsible for all of it. If this invasion failed, Nazi Germany would have years to build new weapons, perhaps even atomic bombs. If this invasion failed, millions more innocent people would die. The freedom of the entire world depended on what happened on 5 beaches in the next few hours. The reports coming in were not good. At a beach codenamed Omaha, American soldiers were dying by the hundreds. They were pinned down on the sand, unable to move forward or backward. German machine guns cut them down as soon as they left their landing craft. The water was red with blood. Bodies floated in the surf. Some units had already lost 70% of their men, and the battle had barely begun. At another beach called Sword, British troops were struggling to make progress. The Germans were fighting with desperate ferocity, and every yard of ground came at a terrible cost. The invasion that was supposed to sweep across France like an unstoppable tide was stuck. Men were dying on 5 different beaches, and Eisenhower could only wait and hope and pray that his plan would work. Then a young officer burst into the room. He carried a single piece of paper. His hand was shaking as he handed it to the Supreme Commander. Eisenhower took the paper and read it once. Then he read it again. His eyes went wide. He looked up at his Chief of Staff, General Walter Bedell Smith. When Eisenhower spoke, his voice was quiet, but every officer in that crowded room heard him clearly. "The 29th Division," he said. "They are through. Minutes." The room went silent. Every officer stopped what they were doing. Every telephone seemed to stop ringing at once. Every voice fell quiet. 47 minutes. The 29th Infantry Division had broken through the Atlantic Wall in 7 minutes. The same division that everyone called the failures of Kasserine. The same division that had been humiliated in their first battle against the Germans. The same division that Allied commanders had quietly worried might break and run when the real fighting started. They had not broken. They had not run. They had done in 47 minutes what military planners feared might take an entire day. Eisenhower stared at the paper for a long moment. Then he spoke again, and the words he said next would be remembered for decades. "Gentlemen," he said, "let me tell you something about soldiers who have known failure. They do not fight for glory. They do not fight to prove anything to the world. They fight to redeem themselves. They fight for each other, and that makes them the most dangerous fighters on earth." But what made the 29th Division so determined to prove themselves, what shadow hung over them so heavily that they were willing to run straight into machine gun fire rather than face another defeat, to understand that you need to know about Kasserine Pass. February 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. 15 months before D-Day. The 29th Infantry Division arrived in North Africa believing they were ready for war. They had trained for months in the United States. They had practiced maneuvers. They had fired their weapons on ranges where targets did not shoot back. They believed the newsreels and the propaganda that told them American soldiers were the best in the world. Then they met the German Africa Corps under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. It was a disaster. The Germans hit the American lines like a thunderstorm. Their tanks were better. Their tactics were superior. Their soldiers had been fighting and winning for years, while the Americans had never faced combat before. In 1 week, 500 American soldiers became casualties. 300 American tanks were destroyed. Nearly 4,000 Americans were captured and sent to prisoner of war camps. The survivors retreated in chaos, leaving behind equipment and weapons and the bodies of their friends. The newspapers back home called it a national humiliation. The British, who had been fighting the Germans for years, looked at their American allies with barely concealed contempt. They called the American soldiers amateurs. They whispered that perhaps the United States did not have the stomach for real war. The 29th Division had lost 60% of some companies in those terrible days. The survivors came out of Kasserine with the taste of defeat bitter in their mouths. They had seen their friends die. They had seen their lines collapse. They had run when they should have stood firm. The men who survived Kasserine would carry that shame with them every day for the next 15 months. Among them was a young captain named Marcus Flynn. Flynn was 32 years old in June of 1944. He came from a small cattle ranch in Montana where the winters were hard and the work was harder. His father had served in the First World War and came home with a chest full of medals and lungs full of poison gas. He died when Marcus was 14 years old, coughing blood into a handkerchief while his son held his hand. Before he died, Flynn's father had told him something that Marcus never forgot. In war, he had said, the important thing is not whether you live or die. The important thing is whether you have the courage to step through the gates of hell when duty calls. Flynn had carried those words with him through Kasserine. He had carried them through 15 months of brutal training in England. He had carried them onto the ship that would take him to Normandy, and he carried them in a letter from his mother. She had written it just before she passed away from pneumonia in the winter of 1943. The paper was worn thin from being read hundreds of times. The words were burned into his memory. "My son," she had written, "your father once told me that when you stand at the gates of hell, the only question that matters is whether you have the courage to step through. I believe you do. I have always believed it." Now, on the morning of June 6th, Flynn was no longer a captain. He had been promoted to major after demonstrating exceptional leadership in training exercises. He commanded a company of 180 men, most of them boys who had never seen combat. But Flynn had seen it. Flynn remembered Kasserine. Flynn remembered the screams of wounded men and the thunder of German tanks and the sickening feeling of watching everything fall apart. He had sworn to himself that he would never let that happen again. Never. 10 miles across the English Channel on the coast of Normandy, another man was also preparing for what the morning would bring. His name was Heinrich Vogel. He was 34 years old, and before the war he had been an elementary school teacher in a small village in Bavaria. He had taught children how to read. He had taught them arithmetic and geography and the poetry of Goethe. He had a wife named Marta and 2 daughters. Anna was 8 years old and Liesel was 5. Vogel had never wanted to be a soldier. He had been conscripted in 1941, torn away from his family and his students and the quiet life he loved. He had been sent to the Eastern Front, where he fought against the Russians in conditions so terrible that they haunted his dreams for the rest of his life. He had seen men freeze to death in the snow outside Stalingrad. He had seen things that no school teacher should ever have to see. He had done things that kept him awake at night, things he could never tell Marta, about things he prayed his daughters would never know. When he was transferred to Normandy in early 1944 to help defend the Atlantic Wall, Vogel had felt something almost like relief. This was supposed to be a quiet posting. The Fuhrer himself had declared the Atlantic Wall impregnable. No army could break through those defenses. Vogel was assigned to Strong Point Wilhelm, a concrete bunker overlooking one of the beaches that Allied intelligence had designated as a potential landing zone. The bunker had walls 6 feet thick. It housed an MG-42 machine gun that could fire 200 rounds per minute. From his position, Vogel could see across the entire beach and hundreds of yards out to sea. If the Allies came to this beach, he would be one of the first to see them, and one of the first to start killing them. On the night of June 5, 1944, Vogel sat in his bunker and wrote a letter to his wife by candlelight. "My dearest Marta," he wrote, "they say the Allies will come soon. Perhaps tomorrow. Perhaps next week. I do not know what will happen when they arrive. But I want you to know that whatever happens, I have tried to remain a decent man in a world gone mad." He paused, his pen hovering over the paper. Outside, he could hear the distant rumble of thunder. Or perhaps it was not thunder. Perhaps it was the sound of history preparing to unfold. "If I do not return," he continued, "please tell Anna and Liesel that their father loved them more than anything in the world. Tell them that war has no glory, only loss." He folded the letter but did not seal it. He would add more in the morning if he had time. He tucked it inside his helmet next to the photograph of his family that he always kept close to his heart. Then he lay down on his narrow cot and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow might be the last day of his life. Aboard the USS Bayfield, 3:00 a.m., June 6, 1944. Major Marcus Flynn could not sleep. He stood on the deck of the transport ship, looking out at the darkness of the English Channel. The waves were enormous, 6 feet high, rocking the ship back and forth with a motion that had turned many of his men green with seasickness. The spray was cold and tasted of salt when it hit his lips. Below decks, his men were trying to rest before the battle. Some played poker by flashlight, betting cigarettes and chocolate bars they might never get to enjoy. Some wrote letters to wives and mothers, and sweethearted letters that might be the last words their families ever received from them. Some just sat in silence, staring at nothing, trying not to think about what dawn would bring. Flynn pulled out his mother's letter and read it again, even though he knew every word by heart. The paper was soft from handling the ink faded in places, but the words were still clear. "When you stand at the gates of hell, the only question that matters is whether you have the courage to step through." In a few hours, he would find out if he had that courage. From somewhere below decks, he could hear music playing softly on a portable radio, Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade. The melody drifted up through the darkness, gentle and sweet, so completely at odds with what was about to happen that Flynn felt his throat tighten. Nearby, he could smell coffee brewing in the galley. Some sailor or cook was making a fresh pot, the aroma mixing with the salt spray and the diesel fumes from the engines. It was such an ordinary smell. Such a peaceful American smell. Coffee brewing in the early morning, just like in diners and kitchens all across the country he was fighting to protect. Flynn thought about all the things he might never experience again. The taste of his mother's apple pie, the smell of hay in the barn on his family's ranch, the feel of a horse beneath him as he rode across the Montana grasslands, with the mountains rising blue in the distance. He folded the letter and put it back in his pocket next to his heart. Then he went below to check on his men. The Callahan brothers were sitting together in a corner of the troop compartment, their shoulders touching, their helmets tilted back on their heads. Tommy was 24, the older of the two. He had been working at the shipyards in Boston when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. The next day, he walked into the recruiting office and signed up. He was broad-shouldered and strong-jawed with hands calloused from years of physical labor. He did not talk much, but when he spoke, people listened. James was 21, 3 years younger, in a world different. He had been a sophomore at Harvard when the war started, studying literature and dreaming of becoming a writer. He was slender where Tommy was thick, thoughtful where Tommy was direct. He kept a journal that he wrote in every night, filling page after page with observations and reflections that he hoped might someday become something more. When James announced that he was dropping out of college to enlist, Tommy had tried to stop him. "You're the smart one in the family," Tommy had said. "You have a future. Stay in school. Let me do the fighting." But James had refused. "If you die and I am not there," he had said, "I will never forgive myself." So they had enlisted together. They had trained together. They had survived Kasserine together, watching out for each other when everything else was falling apart. They had made a promise to their mother that they would come home together, both of them alive and whole. Now, on the night before D-Day, they sat side by side in the belly of a ship crossing toward France, and neither of them could think of anything to say. Finally, Tommy reached into his pocket and pulled out a small coin. It was a silver dollar tarnished with age with a date from 1892 stamped on one side. Their father had given them this coin before he died. It was his lucky piece, the one he had carried through 20 years of working the dangerous wharves of Boston Harbor. He had pressed it into Tommy's hand on his deathbed and made him promise to keep it safe. Tommy held the coin out to James. "Take this," he said. "Keep it with you." James shook his head. "No, that is yours. Dad gave it to you." Tommy pressed the coin into his brother's hand. "I need you to hold on to it, just until we get through tomorrow. Then you can give it back." James looked down at the coin. The silver caught the dim light and gleamed. "We are going to make it through," James said. "Both of us. We promised Mom." Tommy smiled, but there was something sad in his eyes. Something that looked almost like goodbye. "Yeah," he said. "We promised." He squeezed his brother's shoulder once hard. Then he pulled his helmet down over his eyes and pretended to sleep. James sat awake for a long time, turning the coin over and over in his fingers, listening to the sounds of the ship and trying not to be afraid. 5:30 a.m., June 6, 1944. The naval bombardment began before dawn. The great battleships and cruisers of the Allied fleet opened fire on the German positions along the coast of Normandy. The roar was like nothing any of the soldiers had ever heard. It was like thunder that never stopped, like the sky itself was being torn apart. Shells the size of automobiles screamed through the darkness and exploded on the beaches. The coastline erupted in fire and smoke. Great columns of debris shot into the air. The soldiers on the transport ships watched the display with a mixture of awe and hope. Surely nothing could survive such a bombardment. Surely the German bunkers would be destroyed and the landing would be easy. But the naval gunners could not see their targets through the smoke and darkness. The heavy seas made the ships rock and pitch, throwing off their aim. Most of the shells fell short or went long, exploding harmlessly in empty fields or plunging into the waves. The reconnaissance aircraft that flew over the beaches after the bombardment sent back a grim report. 85% of enemy defensive positions still intact. Repeat, 85% still intact. Major Flynn received this news over his radio. His face did not change expression as he listened, but inside his stomach clenched like a fist. 85%. That meant almost all of the machine gun nests were still operational. Almost all of the bunkers were still manned and ready. The bombardment that was supposed to soften up the defenses had accomplished almost nothing. His men were about to land on a beach that was still a killing ground. Flynn looked at the faces of the soldiers around him. Young faces, scared faces. They did not know yet. They still believed the bombardment had worked. They still believed the landing would be the relatively easy operation they had been promised in the briefings. He made a decision. He would not tell them. Let them have their hope for a few more minutes. Let them have their courage. They would learn the truth soon enough. 7:30 a.m., 15 minutes before H hour. The landing craft were loaded and heading toward shore. Flynn stood at the bow of his boat, feeling the spray lash his face with every wave. The craft was packed with 30 men, pressed together so tightly they could barely move. Many of them were seasick, vomiting over the sides or into their helmets. The smell was terrible. Flynn could see the beach now. It was still far away, but he could make out the shapes of the obstacles the Germans had placed in the water. Steel hedgehogs like giant metal jacks designed to tear the bottoms out of landing craft. Wooden poles as thick as telephone poles, topped with mines that would explode at the slightest touch. Tangles of barbed wire waiting just beneath the surface. Beyond the obstacles, he could see the seawall, and beyond the seawall, the bunkers. Gray concrete shapes against the green of the hills. He could see the narrow slits in the bunkers where the machine guns waited. Those slits were dark now, silent, but in a few minutes they would erupt with fire, and many of the men standing in this boat would never see another sunrise. Flynn turned to look at his soldiers. Some of them were praying, some were checking their weapons for the 10th time. Some just stared straight ahead with empty eyes, their minds already on the beach, already running through the chaos they knew was coming. Flynn thought about what to say to them. He thought about the speeches he had heard in movies, the grand words about freedom and democracy and fighting for what was right. But these men did not need speeches. They needed something real, something true. He raised his voice so they could all hear him over the roar of the engine and the crash of the waves. "Listen to me," he shouted. "You know what they call us, the failures of Kasserine, the division that broke and ran. They think we cannot fight." The men looked at him. Their eyes were wide. Their faces were pale. "But they do not know what we know. They do not know that we have trained harder than any division in this army. They do not know that we have practiced this landing 50 times. They do not know that we have learned from every mistake we made at Kasserine." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Today, we do not fight for medals. We do not fight for glory. We fight for the men who died at Kasserine. We fight for each other, and we will not stop. We will not slow down. We will not give up until we break through that wall or die trying." He looked at each of them in turn. At Tommy Callahan, his jaw set with determination. At James Callahan, clutching his father's coin in his pocket. At all the other young men who were about to run into the fire with him. "When that ramp drops," Flynn said, "we move forward. No matter what, we move forward until we are through. That is the only way any of us are getting home." The men nodded. Some of them straightened their shoulders. Some of them checked their weapons one more time, and the beach grew closer. "Strong Point, Wilhelm, 7:45 a.m. Heinrich Vogel heard them before he saw them. The sound of engines, hundreds of engines, a low rumble that grew louder and louder until it filled the air like the buzz of enormous insects. He pressed his eye to the observation slit and felt his blood turn to ice. The sea was full of ships. Landing craft by the hundreds spread across the water in rows that stretched to the horizon. Behind them, larger ships belched smoke and fire as their guns continued to pound the coastline. Aircraft screamed overhead, so many that they darkened the sky. This was it, the invasion everyone had been waiting for. The invasion that would decide the fate of Europe. Vogel's hand trembled as he gripped the stock of his MG-42. Behind him, his assistant gunner, a boy named Werner, who was only 17 years old, began to whimper. Werner had been a student in Berlin before the war. He had been studying to be a musician. Now he was crouched in a bunker, waiting to kill or be killed, and he was crying. "Steady," Vogel said. "Stay focused. Wait until they are on the beach before you open fire." But Werner's hands were shaking so badly he could barely load the ammunition belt. Vogel looked out at the approaching boats. He thought about Marta. He thought about Anna and Liesel. He thought about the letter in his helmet that he would probably never finish. And he made a decision that would determine everything that happened next. He would fight. He would do his duty. He would try to stop the Americans from reaching the shore. But if the moment came when fighting was hopeless, he would not throw away the lives of his men in a pointless last stand. He would surrender with honor if surrender became the only option. He was a school teacher, not a fanatic. He wanted to see his daughters again. The first landing craft were approaching the obstacles now. Vogel could see the Americans inside packed together like sardines, their helmets visible above the sides of the boats. He took a deep breath. He put his finger on the trigger, and he waited for hell to begin. 7:49 a.m. H hour. The ramp dropped. Sunlight flooded into the landing craft. For one brief moment, everything was silent. The waves lapped against the hull. The morning air was almost peaceful. Then the German machine guns opened fire. The sound was like nothing Flynn had ever heard, like 1,000 jackhammers, like the sky being ripped apart, like the fabric of the world itself being torn to shreds. Bullets tore through the men standing at the front of the boat. They fell without screaming, their bodies crumpling like puppets with cut strings. The soldiers behind them had no time to react. The ramp was down, and the bullets were flying, and there was nowhere to go but forward. Flynn jumped. The water was chest-deep and cold as ice. It knocked the breath out of him. The weight of his pack and his weapons tried to drag him down. Waves slapped against his face. Around him, men were falling into the water, some already dead, some wounded and screaming. He forced himself to move. One step, another step. The sand beneath his feet was soft and treacherous. The current pulled at his legs. Bullets hissed past his ears so close he could feel the wind of their passing. A man next to him jerked and fell. Blood bloomed in the water around him like a dark flower. Flynn kept moving. He reached the shallow water and began to run. The beach stretched ahead of him, 200 yards of open sand between the waterline and the seawall. 200 yards with no cover. 200 yards of killing ground. Men were falling all around him, cut down by machine gun fire, torn apart by mortar rounds. The sand was already turning red. Bodies lay everywhere, some still moving, most terribly still. Flynn threw himself down behind a disabled tank, its tracks blown off by a mine, its hull pockmarked with bullet holes. He pressed himself against the metal and tried to catch his breath. The noise was beyond description. Machine guns, explosions, screams. The crack of rifles and the thud of bullets hitting flesh. The roar of aircraft overhead and the thunder of naval guns offshore. And through it all, the terrible endless chatter of the German MG-42s pouring fire down onto the beach from the bunkers on the hill. Flynn looked around at what remained of his company. Half of them were down, dead or wounded or simply frozen with fear, unable to move from where they had fallen. He saw the Callahan brothers huddled behind a wooden obstacle, Tommy shielding James with his body. He saw Sergeant Miller trying to drag a wounded man toward cover, only to be cut down by a burst of machine gun fire. He saw boys who had been laughing and joking on the ship just hours ago now lying still in the red surf. And he saw the bunker. Strong Point Wilhelm, the concrete walls, the dark slit where the machine guns spat death. That bunker was killing his men. That bunker had to be stopped. Flynn looked at his watch, 8:05 a.m. 16 minutes since the ramp had dropped, and in those 16 minutes he had lost half his company. The tide was rising. The beach was shrinking. In 30 minutes, this sand would be underwater. The wounded who could not move would drown. The reinforcements would have nowhere to land. This was Kasserine all over again. This was failure. This was death, unless someone did something impossible. Flynn thought about his mother's letter, about the words she had written before she died. When you stand at the gates of hell, the only question that matters is whether you have the courage to step through. He was at the gates now. The gates were wide open, and hell was on the other side. Major Marcus Flynn made a decision that would change history. He was going to stand up. He was going to run straight at that machine gun. He was going to lead his men through the gates of hell or die trying. It was the only way any of them were getting off this beach alive. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a clock was ticking. 47 minutes. In 47 minutes, everything would change. 8:05 a.m., June 6, 1944. The beach. The sand was red. Major Marcus Flynn pressed his back against the burning hull of a disbellied Sherman tank and tried to make himself as small as possible. Bullets pinged off the metal above his head. Each impact sent a shower of sparks into the smoke-filled air. The heat from the burning engine was intense, but he did not dare move away from the only cover he had. Around him, the beach had become a slaughterhouse. Bodies lay everywhere. Some floated in the shallow water, rocking gently with the waves. Others were sprawled across the sand in positions that no living person could hold. A few of the wounded were trying to crawl toward the seawall, leaving trails of blood behind them like terrible red ribbons. The noise was beyond anything Flynn had ever experienced. The German MG-42 machine guns made a sound unlike any other weapon in the world. Not the rhythmic chatter of American guns, but a continuous tearing roar, like canvas being ripped by giant hands. The bullets came so fast that individual shots could not be distinguished, just an endless stream of death pouring down from the bunkers on the hill. Flynn looked at his watch. 16 minutes since the ramp had dropped. 16 minutes and half his company was already gone. He forced himself to assess the situation. To his left, a group of soldiers had taken cover behind a row of steel hedgehogs. They were pinned down, unable to move forward or backward. Every time one of them raised his head, the machine guns would open up and drive him back down. To his right, a medic was trying desperately to save a wounded man. The medic's hands were red to the elbows. The wounded man was screaming a high-pitched sound that cut through even the thunder of the guns. Then the screaming stopped, And the medic bowed his head, and Flynn knew another American had died on this terrible beach. Straight ahead, 200 yards away, the seawall rose like an impassable barrier. Beyond it, the bunkers squatted on the hillside like gray concrete toads. And from those bunkers, the machine guns continued their relentless harvest. Flynn thought about the briefings they had received before the landing. The naval bombardment will destroy the German defenses, they had been told. The beach will be softened up. You will face minimal resistance. Lies. All lies. Or perhaps just terrible miscalculation. Either way, the result was the same. His men were dying because someone had been wrong about what waited for them on this beach. And now Flynn had to figure out how to get the survivors off this killing ground before they all joined the dead. Strong point, Wilhelm. The same moment. Heinrich Vogel's finger was cramped from squeezing the trigger. He had been firing for 16 minutes straight. The barrel of his MG-42 was so hot that the air around it shimmered like a mirage. He had already changed barrels twice. The pile of spent brass casings around his feet was ankle deep. Through the narrow slit of the bunker, he could see the Americans on the beach below. They were everywhere, huddled behind obstacles, pressed flat against the sand, floating in the bloody water. And still they kept coming. Every time Vogel thought the attack must be over, another wave of landing craft would appear. More ramps would drop. More men would pour out into the killing zone. And Vogel would squeeze the trigger again, and more of them would fall. Behind him, Werner was sobbing as he fed ammunition belts into the gun. The boy's hands were shaking so badly that he kept fumbling the belts, and Vogel had to shout at him to focus. "Concentrate," Vogel yelled over the roar of the gun. "Keep the ammunition coming. Do not think about anything else." But how could anyone not think about what they were doing? Vogel had killed men before. On the Eastern Front, he had done terrible things to survive. But that had been different somehow. That had been combat soldier against soldier, kill, or be killed in the chaos of battle. This was something else. This was slaughter. The Americans had no cover on that beach. They were completely exposed. Every time Vogel pulled the trigger, he could see men fall. He could see their bodies jerk and spin and crumple. These were not faceless enemies. Through his gun sight, Vogel could see their faces. Young faces. Frightened faces. Faces that reminded him of his students back in Bavaria. Boys who should have been playing football or chasing girls, not dying on a beach in France. A voice in his head whispered, "These are someone's sons, someone's husbands, someone's fathers." Somewhere in America, there are families who will receive telegrams because of what you are doing right now. But another voice answered, "If you stop shooting, they will kill you. They will kill Werner. They will pour through this bunker and sweep across France, and eventually they will reach Germany, and then what will happen to Marta and Anna and Liesel?" So Vogel kept shooting. He kept killing. And with each burst of fire, he felt something inside himself die as well. The beach, 8:10 a.m., the tide was rising. Flynn had noticed it 5 minutes ago, but now the reality was becoming impossible to ignore. When the landing craft had first dropped their ramps, there had been 200 yards of sand between the waterline and the seawall. Now there was less than 150 yards, and the water was still coming in. He did the calculation in his head. At this rate, the beach would be completely underwater in less than 30 minutes. The wounded who could not move would drown. The reinforcements scheduled to land in the next wave would have nowhere to go. They would be trapped in their boats, sitting ducks for the German guns. And there was something else, something even worse. Flynn had heard the radio chatter about the German 21st Panzer Division. These were elite troops with the best tanks in the German army. They were positioned inland waiting to counterattack. If they reached the beach while the Americans were still pinned down, it would be a massacre. The clock was ticking. Every minute that passed brought the tide higher and the German tanks closer. Flynn looked around at his men. The ones who were still alive were pressed flat against whatever cover they could find. Steel obstacles, disabled vehicles, the bodies of their fallen comrades. None of them were moving forward. None of them were retreating. They were simply frozen, trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. This is Kasserine, Flynn thought. This is exactly what happened at Kasserine. We are pinned down. We are taking casualties. We are going to break. No. The word formed in his mind with absolute clarity. No, not this time. Not again. He thought about his mother's letter, about the words she had written before she died. When you stand at the gates of hell, the only question that matters is whether you have the courage to step through. Flynn looked up at the bunker on the hill, Strong Point Wilhelm, the machine gun that was killing his men. That bunker was 200 yards away, 200 yards of open ground with no cover, 200 yards of certain death for anyone foolish enough to try to cross it. But if someone did not do something, everyone on this beach was going to die anyway. Flynn made his decision. He was going to stand up. He was going to charge that bunker. He was going to lead his men through the gates of hell. It was the only way. 8:11 a.m., the moment of truth. Flynn took one last breath. He thought about Montana, about the ranch where he grew up, about the mountains rising blue against the western sky, about his mother's face and his father's voice, and all the things he might never see or hear again. Then he stopped thinking. He stood up, right there in the middle of all that fire, in the middle of all that death. He rose to his feet and faced the German bunker. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The bullets continued to fly. The explosions continued to thunder. But Flynn was no longer aware of any of it. He was aware only of the bunker ahead of him and the men behind him and the choice he had made. He filled his lungs with air and screamed at the top of his voice. 29th Division, on your feet, forward, forward, forward. Then he ran. He ran straight toward the machine guns. One hand held his rifle. The other held a grenade. His boots pounded against the bloody sand. His heart hammered in his chest. And all around him, bullets cracked and whined, missing him by inches, by centimeters, by margins so small that physics alone could not explain how he was still alive. The domino effect. Private First Class Robert Anderson was 19 years old. He was from a small town in Ohio where his father owned a hardware store. He had enlisted the day after his 18th birthday because he wanted to be a hero. Now he was lying face down on a French beach, too terrified to move, watching his friends die by all around him. When Major Flynn stood up, Anderson was certain he was watching a dead man. No one could survive in that fire. No one could cross that open ground. Flynn was committing suicide, and Anderson was going to watch him die. But Flynn did not die. He ran 10 yards, 20 yards, 30 yards, and he was still running, still screaming, still alive. Something changed inside Anderson. Later, he would not be able to explain it. It was like a switch had been thrown in his brain. One moment he was paralyzed with fear. The next moment he was on his feet. If the Major can do it, he thought, then so can I. He started running. To his left, another soldier saw Anderson running and thought the same thing. He stood up and ran too. Then another, and another, and another. Within seconds, what had been a scattered group of terrified individuals became a wave. A wave of men rising from the sand and charging forward, screaming, firing, following the Major who had shown them that the impossible was possible. Tommy and James Callahan. The Callahan brothers were huddled behind a concrete obstacle when they heard Flynn's voice. Tommy looked at James. James looked at Tommy. They did not need to speak. They had been together their whole lives. They knew what the other was thinking. Tommy stood first. He grabbed his rifle and started running. James was right behind him. They ran side by side just like they had done everything else in their lives. Brothers in arms, brothers in blood, brothers who had promised their mother they would come home together. The machine gun fire was like rain. Tommy could hear bullets snapping past his ears. He could feel the wind of near misses on his face. But he kept running, because James was beside him, because the Major was ahead of him, because stopping meant dying and he was not ready to die. They reached the seawall together, 12 feet of concrete, barbed wire on top, impossible to climb. But the engineers were already there shoving Bangalore torpedoes under the wall. These were long pipes filled with explosives designed to blow gaps in fortifications. "Cover us," one of the engineers screamed. "We need 30 seconds. Tommy dropped to one knee and started firing at the German positions. James did the same. They poured bullets at the bunkers, not really aiming, just trying to keep the Germans' heads down long enough for the engineers to do their work. The seconds stretched into eternity. 10 seconds, 15, 20. Then the engineer shouted, "Fire in the hole." Tommy grabbed James and pulled him down. The explosion was enormous. Chunks of concrete flew through the air. Dust and smoke billowed outward. And when the smoke cleared, there was a gap in the wall, a jagged opening just wide enough for men to pass through. "Go!" Tommy screamed. Go, go, go! James went first. Tommy was right behind him. They were through the wall. Leo Garrett in the Detroit Dream. Sergeant Leo Garrett had been a mechanic at the Ford plant in Detroit before the war. He knew engines the way some men knew poetry. He could diagnose a problem just by listening. He could fix anything with wheels or treads. Now he commanded a Sherman tank named Detroit Dream. He had painted the logo of the Detroit Tigers on the turret, a snarling tiger that reminded him of home. Inside the tank next to his seat, he kept a photograph of his wife Helen and their 2-year-old daughter Sarah. Garrett had watched Major Flynn stand up and charge the bunker. He had seen the wave of infantry follow, and he had made his own decision. Those boys need cover, he said to his driver. Get us up that hill, now. The Detroit Dream lurched forward, treads churning through the sand. Bullets pinged off the armor like hail on a tin roof. A mortar round exploded nearby, showering the tank with debris. But Garrett kept going. He had a plan. The bunkers had walls 6 feet thick. Regular tank shells could not penetrate them. But the bunkers had one weakness: the machine gun slits, those narrow openings where the barrels poke through. If Garrett could get close enough, if he could aim his gun directly into those slits, he could kill the gunners inside without having to break through the concrete. It was insane. It meant driving right up to the bunkers close enough to touch them. It meant exposing his tank to point-blank fire from weapons designed to destroy armor. But Garrett had seen what those machine guns were doing to the infantry. He had seen boys from Ohio and Texas and California cut down like wheat before a scythe, and he was tired of watching. Detroit Dream climbed the slope. The engine roared. The treads bit into the earth, and Garrett lined up his first shot. The bunker was 30 feet away. He could see the muzzle flash of the machine gun through the slit. He could see bullets sparking off his armor. He aimed for the slit. He fired. The 75mm shell screamed across the short distance and punched through the narrow opening. The explosion inside the bunker was muffled, contained by those 6-foot-thick walls. But Garrett knew what had happened inside. No one could survive a high-explosive shell detonating in such an enclosed space. The machine gun fell silent. Garrett was already moving to the next bunker. Same technique. Get close. Aim for the slit. Fire. Boom. Another bunker silenced. Boom. Another. In 5 minutes, Garrett destroyed 3 bunkers. 3 machine gun nests that had been pouring death onto the beach. 3 positions that everyone said were impregnable. The infantry surged forward through the gaps he had created, and somewhere in the chaos, Garrett allowed himself a small smile. That is for Sarah, he whispered. That is for Helen. That is for everyone back home who is counting on us. 8:17 a.m. The death of Tommy Callahan. Tommy and James had made it through the gap in the seawall. They were in the streets of the village now, fighting house to house, room to room. The Germans were everywhere, behind every corner, in every window. The combat was close and brutal. Rifle fire at point-blank range, grenades through doorways, hand-to-hand fighting with bayonets and rifle butts. Tommy stayed in front, always in front, shielding James with his body just as he had done their entire lives. They cleared one house, then another. The Germans fell back, but slowly fighting for every inch of ground. At 8:17, they reached a small plaza. There was a fountain in the center, dry and crumbling. Buildings surrounded it on 3 sides. And from one of those buildings, a German machine gun opened fire. Tommy saw the muzzle flash a split second before the bullets arrived. He did not think. He simply reacted. He threw himself in front of James. The bullets meant for James struck Tommy instead. 3 rounds to the chest. He felt them hit like hammer blows. The impact spun him around and dropped him to the cobblestones. James screamed. He caught his brother as Tommy fell. He lowered him gently to the ground, cradling Tommy's head in his lap. Tommy, he sobbed. Tommy, no, please, no. Tommy looked up at his brother. Blood was bubbling on his lips. His eyes were already growing dim. He tried to speak. The words came out as a whisper so soft that James had to lean close to hear. You stay alive. You hear me. You go home. Tell Ma. Tell her I love her. James was crying. Tears ran down his face and dripped onto Tommy's uniform. We were supposed to go home together. We promised. Tommy managed a small smile, the smile of a man who knew he was dying and had accepted it. You keep the coin. he whispered. You carry it home for both of us. And you live, James. You live a good life. That is all I ever wanted for you. His hand found James's and squeezed once weakly. Then the light went out of his eyes, and Tommy Callahan was gone. Strong Point, Wilhelm, 8:20 a.m. Heinrich Vogel knew the end was coming. He could hear the Americans outside the bunker, shouting, shooting, getting closer with every passing second. The other bunkers in his section had gone silent, one by one, either destroyed by the tanks or overrun by infantry. His own bunker was the last one still fighting. Werner had stopped crying. The boy had retreated to a corner of the bunker and was sitting with his knees drawn up to his chest, rocking back and forth, muttering prayers under his breath. The other 3 soldiers in the bunker were wounded or dead. One lay slumped over an ammunition crate with a hole in his forehead. Another was clutching a bloody stomach wound and moaning softly. The third sat against the wall with empty eyes, his mind broken by what he had seen and done. Vogel looked at his remaining ammunition, maybe 200 rounds, enough for another minute of sustained fire, maybe 2 if he was careful. He looked at the men around him. Boys, really. The oldest was 19. The youngest, Werner, was 17. Children playing at being soldiers thrust into a nightmare they were never prepared for. He thought about Marta, about Anna and Liesel, about the letter in his helmet that he would never finish. He had a choice to make. He could keep fighting, keep killing until the ammunition ran out. Then the Americans would storm the bunker and they would probably kill everyone inside. That was what the propaganda said Americans did. That was what the officers had told him to expect. Or he could surrender. Save the lives of the Maos in his command. Take the chance that the Americans were not the monsters the propaganda claimed. It was not a difficult choice. Vogel stood up from his gun. He looked at Werner. Put down your weapon, he said quietly. All of you. The war is over for us. Werner stared at him with red-rimmed eyes. But we cannot surrender. They will execute us. The officers said, The officers are not here, Vogel replied. I am in command, and I am ordering you to put down your weapons. He walked to the door of the bunker. He could hear American voices just outside. He could hear the click of a grenade pin being pulled. In a few seconds, that grenade would come through the door, and everyone inside would die. Vogel opened the door. The meeting. Major Marcus Flynn was standing outside the bunker with a grenade in his hand. He had fought his way up the hill with what remained of his company. They had taken the village house by house. They had broken through the seawall, and now they were here at the last German strong point ready to finish the job. Flynn's finger was on the pin of the grenade. One pull, one throw, and everyone inside that bunker would be dead. Justice for all the Americans those machine guns had killed. Then the door opened. A German soldier stepped out. His hands were raised above his head. He wore no helmet. His face was pale and drawn and streaked with sweat. He looked at Flynn. Flynn looked at him. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then the German spoke. His English was broken, heavily accented, but understandable. Please, he said, do not shoot my men. They are just children. Flynn stared at him. His hand still held the grenade. His finger still rested on the pin. Behind him, one of his soldiers raised his rifle. Major, the soldier, said, his voice tight with rage. These bastards just killed half our company. Let me end this. Flynn did not respond. He was looking at the German, looking into his eyes. What he saw there surprised him. He had expected to see hatred, defiance, the cold stare of a fanatic. Instead, he saw exhaustion, fear, and something else, something that looked almost like relief. This man was not a monster. This man was a human being who had done terrible things because he had no choice. And now he was standing here with his hands up, begging for the lives of his men. Flynn thought about all the Americans who had died on the beach. He thought about the bodies floating in the surf. He thought about the screams of the wounded and the silence of the dead. He thought about revenge. And then he thought about something else. He thought about who he wanted to be, what kind of man, what kind of soldier, what kind of American. His mother had written about having the courage to step through the gates of hell. She had not written about becoming a monster once you got to the other side. Flynn lowered the grenade. Come out, he said to the German. All of you, hands up. You are prisoners of war. The German closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, they were wet. Thank you, he whispered. 4 more Germans emerged from the bunker. Young faces, terrified faces. One of them, a boy who could not have been more than 17, was weeping openly. Flynn looked at his men. "Medic," he called out. "Treat any wounded, including the Germans." One of his soldiers protested. "Sir, these are the men who—" "I know what they are," Flynn cut him off. "And I know what we are. We are American soldiers. We do not murder prisoners. We do not become what we are fighting against. Is that clear?" The soldier hesitated, then he nodded. "Yes, sir." The German who had surrendered was watching Flynn with an expression that was hard to read. You could have killed us," he said. "Why did you not?" Flynn met his eyes. "Because that is not who we are," he said. "And because somewhere in Germany, there are people waiting for you to come home, just like there are people in America waiting for us." The German nodded slowly. He seemed to be struggling with something, some emotion he could not express. "My name is Heinrich Vogel," he said finally. "I was a school teacher before the war." Flynn nodded. "Marcus Flynn. I was a rancher, Montana." They stood there for a moment, two men from opposite sides of the world, enemies who had been trying to kill each other just moments ago. The battle still raged around them. Explosions thundered in the distance. Men were still dying, but in this small space for this brief instant, something had changed. Vogel would remember this moment for the rest of his life. The moment when an enemy soldier showed him mercy. The moment when a man who had every right to hate him chose compassion instead. It would change everything. Would. 8:36 a.m. The message. The radio operator crouched behind a ruined wall, his equipment balanced on his knee. His hands were steady despite the chaos around him. He keyed the microphone and spoke clearly into the handset. "Command, this is Charlie Company, 29th Division. Sector secure. I repeat, sector secure, proceeding inland." There was a pause. Then a voice crackled back, heavy with disbelief. "Charlie Company, confirm. You are reporting sector secure." "Confirmed," the radio operator replied. "We are through the wall. We are through." He looked at his watch, 8:36 a.m. The landing had begun at 7:49, 47 minutes. The 29th Infantry Division had broken through Hitler's Atlantic Wall in 47 minutes. The cost. James Callahan sat in the rubble of a destroyed house cradling his brother's body. He had carried Tommy from the plaza where he fell. Carried him through streets still filled with gunfire and smoke. Carried him until he found this quiet corner where he could sit and hold his brother one last time. Tommy's eyes were closed. His face was peaceful. He looked like he was sleeping. But he was not sleeping. He would never sleep again. He would never laugh again. He would never go home to Boston and see their mother again. James reached into Tommy's pocket and found the lucky coin. The silver dollar their father had carried for 20 years. The coin Tommy had given him just hours ago, telling him to hold on to it until they got through. They had gotten through. The Americans had won. But Tommy had not made it. James clutched the coin in his fist and pressed it against his chest. "I will carry it home," he whispered. "I will carry it home for both of us, I promise." The tears came then, silent tears that ran down his face and dripped onto his brother's uniform. He did not try to stop them. He did not care who saw. He had lost his brother, his best friend, the person who had protected him his whole life, and no victory could ever make that right. The beach, 9:00 a.m. The second wave of American troops landed on a beach that was already secure. They had expected to face the same hell that the first wave had fought through. They had expected machine gun fire and explosions in the chaos of combat. Instead, they found silence. The guns were quiet. The bunkers were destroyed or captured. The German defenders were dead or surrendered or fleeing inland. The soldiers in the second wave walked off their landing craft onto sand that was still stained red. They stepped over bodies and around burning vehicles. They saw the price that had been paid for their safe passage. 340 Americans had died in those 47 minutes. 574 more were wounded. 47 were missing, but the breakthrough was complete. The Atlantic Wall was broken, and nothing would ever be the same. Southwick House, 9:30 a.m. Eisenhower read the report a second time, then a third. He looked up at General Smith. His eyes held something that might have been wonder. "The 29th Division," he said. "Of all the units on all the beaches, it was the 29th Division." Smith nodded, the division everyone thought would fail. Eisenhower set down the report. He walked to the window and looked out at the gray English sky. Do you know what this means? He added quietly. Do you understand what they have done? Smith waited. They have proven something. Eisenhower continued, something more important than tactics or a strategy. They have proven that men who have known failure can become the most determined soldiers in any army, because they are not fighting for glory. They are not fighting for medals. They are fighting to redeem themselves. Fighting for each other, and that makes them unstoppable. He turned back to face the room. Get me a direct line to their commanding officer, he said. I want to tell them personally. I want them to know that today they changed history. The beach, late afternoon. Major Flynn walked among the wounded at the aid station. He had spent the morning pushing inland with his men. They had advanced 9 miles from the beach before finally stopping to consolidate their gains. It was farther than any other Allied unit had gone on D-Day. But now the fighting had paused, and Flynn had come back to the beach. He needed to see it, needed to understand what had happened here. The medics had set up their station near the seawall. Rows of wounded men lay on stretchers waiting for treatment. Some would survive, some would not. All of them would carry scars for the rest of their lives. Flynn moved among them, stopping to speak with each man, telling them they had done well, telling them their sacrifice meant something, telling them the lies that all commanders tell in the aftermath of battle because the truth was too terrible to speak. He found James Callahan sitting alone near the water. The young soldier was staring out at the sea. In his hand, he clutched a silver coin. Flynn sat down beside him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Flynn said quietly, "Your brother was a hero. He died saving your life." James did not look up. He just kept staring at the water. "He promised we would go home together," he said. "He promised." Flynn nodded. He understood. He had made promises too. Promises to men who were now lying under white sheets waiting to be buried. "I know," Flynn said. "Sometimes we cannot keep our promises, no matter how much we want to." James finally looked at him. His eyes were red from crying. "How do I live with this?" he asked. "How do I go home without him?" Flynn thought about the question for a long time before answering. "You live for him," he said finally. "You live the life he wanted you to have. You get married. You have children. You tell them about their uncle who died a hero on a beach in France. And every year on this day you remember. You make sure no one ever forgets what he did." James looked down at the coin in his hand. "He gave me this," he said, "the night before the landing. He told me to hold on to it until we got through." Flynn nodded. "Then hold on to it. Carry it with you for the rest of your life. Let it remind you of who he was and what he sacrificed. And when you are old, pass it on to your children. Let them know the cost of freedom." James closed his fist around the coin. For a long time, neither man spoke. They just sat there on the bloody sand, watching the waves wash over the beach where so many had died. Finally, James stood up. "I should rejoin my unit," he said. "We still have a war to win." Flynn stood as well. "Yes," he said. "We do. For Tommy, for all of them." James nodded. He straightened his helmet. He picked up his rifle. Then he walked back toward the front lines, carrying his brother's coin in his pocket and his brother's memory in his heart. Flynn watched him go. He thought about all the young men who had crossed this beach today, the ones who had made it, the ones who had not. He thought about Heinrich Vogel, the German school teacher, who had surrendered rather than sacrifice his men in a hopeless fight. The man was in a prisoner of war camp now, but Flynn knew their paths would cross again someday. He could not explain how he knew. He just did. He thought about his mother's letter still folded in his pocket, still carrying her words about courage and hell and the choices that define a man. And he thought about those 47 minutes to change history, 47 minutes to prove that failure does not have to be the end of the story, 47 minutes to show the world what American soldiers were capable of when they stopped fighting for glory and started fighting for each other. Flynn took one last look at the beach. The tide was going out now, exposing the sand where so much blood had been spilled. Tomorrow the war would continue. There would be more battles, more death, more sacrifice. But today they had done the impossible. Today they had won. June 6, 1944. Late afternoon, the aid station. The smell of blood and antiseptic hung heavy in the air. Medical corpsman David Cohen had been working without rest since the first wave hit the beach. His hands were stained red to the elbows. His uniform was soaked with the blood of a dozen different men. His eyes burned from exhaustion, but he could not stop. There were too many wounded, too many dying. Cohen was 26 years old from a Jewish family in Brooklyn. His grandparents had fled persecution in Europe 40 years ago. Now he was back on European soil fighting against the very forces that had driven his family away. He moved from stretcher to stretcher, doing what he could. Some men he could save. A tourniquet here, a bandage there, morphine for the pain, words of comfort for the fear. Other men were beyond saving. For them, Cohen could only hold their hands and tell them lies. You are going to be fine. The doctors are coming. Your family is waiting for you at home. Whatever words might bring peace in those final moments. Then they brought in a German. Cohen looked up from the American soldier he was treating and saw two infantrymen carrying a stretcher. On the stretcher lay a man in the gray uniform of the Wehrmacht. His face was pale. His eyes were closed. Blood seeped from wounds in his leg and abdomen. One of the infantrymen spat on the ground. Found him near that bunker on the hill, the soldier said. The one that killed so many of our boys. You want us to just leave him somewhere? Cohen looked at the wounded German. He thought about all the Americans who had died on that beach. He thought about the machine guns that had cut them down. He thought about the bodies floating in the surf and the screams of the wounded and the telegram his own mother would have received if he had been one of the fallen. Put him down, Cohen said. I will treat him. The soldier stared at him in disbelief. This bastard was trying to kill us 3 hours ago. He probably killed dozens of Americans. And you want to waste medical supplies on him? Cohen met the soldier's eyes. I am a medic, he said quietly. I took an oath. I treat the wounded, all the wounded. That is who we are. That is what makes us different from them. The soldier hesitated, then he shrugged and set down the stretcher. Your call, Doc, but if it were up to me, I would let him bleed out. He walked away, leaving Cohen alone with the German. Cohen knelt beside the stretcher and began to examine the wounds. The leg injury was serious but not fatal. The abdominal wound was worse. Without treatment, the man would die within hours. Cohen got to work. Heinrich Vogel. Vogel drifted in and out of consciousness. He remembered the explosion, the shell that had landed near his position after he surrendered, the blast that had thrown him against a wall and torn open his flesh. He remembered American soldiers dragging him somewhere. He remembered pain, so much pain. Now he was lying on something soft. Someone was touching his wounds, gentle hands, careful hands. He opened his eyes. An American soldier was leaning over him. Young, dark hair, tense eyes focused on the work of cleaning and bandaging. Vogel tried to speak. His throat was dry. His voice came out as a croak. Why? The American looked up. Their eyes met. Why what? Why are you helping me after what I did? After everything. The American did not answer immediately. He continued working, threading a needle, preparing to stitch the wound closed. Finally, he spoke. Because that is who we are. And because somewhere in Germany, there is someone waiting for you to come home. Vogel stared at him. He thought about Marta, about Anna and Liesel, about the letter in his helmet that he had never finished. How do you know? The American smiled, a small, sad smile. Because there is someone waiting for all of us, he said. That is why we fight. That is why we survive. And that is why I cannot let you die on this beach, even though you were trying to kill us a few hours ago. Vogel felt something break inside him. Something that had been building for years. All the horror he had witnessed, all the terrible things he had done, all the guilt and shame and self-hatred that came with being a soldier in a war he had never wanted to fight. He began to cry, not from pain, from something deeper, from a crack in the wall he had built around his heart. The American did not say anything. He just kept working, stitching, bandaging, saving the life of a man who had been his enemy. When he was finished, he sat back and looked at Vogel. You are going to live, he said. The wound is serious, but you will survive. You will see your family again. Vogel reached out and grabbed the American's hand. Thank you, he whispered. I will never forget this. Never. The American squeezed his hand once, then gently pulled away. My name is David Cohen, he said. Remember it. And when you go home to Germany, remember that an American Jew saved your life. Maybe that will mean something someday. Vogel nodded. He was too overwhelmed to speak. Cohen stood up and moved to the next stretcher, where another wounded man was waiting. But Vogel lay there for a long time staring at the sky, thinking about what had just happened. An enemy had shown him mercy. First the major who had spared his life. Now this medic who had saved it. These Americans were not the monsters the propaganda had promised. They were men, just men, capable of kindness even in the midst of war. Something changed in Heinrich Vogel that afternoon. Something fundamental. He did not know it yet, but the rest of his life would be shaped by this day. By these moments of unexpected humanity in the middle of hell. The French civilians. As the afternoon wore on, the people of the village began to emerge from their hiding places. For 4 years they had lived under German occupation. 4 years of fear, 4 years of hunger, 4 years of watching their neighbors disappear in the night and wondering if they would be next. Now the Americans had come, and the Germans were gone. Marie Laurent was 67 years old. She had lived in this village her entire life. She had survived 1 world war, already watching her husband march away in 1914 and return 4 years later as a broken man who never smiled again. He had died in 1936, leaving her alone in the small house where they had raised 3 children. Now that house was destroyed. A shell had collapsed the roof, the walls were cracked. Everything she owned was buried under rubble. But Marie did not care about the house. She stepped out into the street and looked around at the American soldiers. Young men, tired men. Men covered in dust and blood and the grime of battle. One of them was sitting alone on a pile of broken stones. He was staring at nothing. His eyes were empty. In his hand he clutched something small and silver. Marie walked toward him. She did not speak English. He probably did not speak French. But she recognized the look on his face. She had seen that look on her husband's face when he came home from the trenches. The look of a man who had lost something precious. She sat down beside him. The young soldier looked up. His eyes were red. He had been crying. Marie reached into her pocket and pulled out a piece of bread. It was stale and hard. It was all she had left. But she broke it in half and offered a piece to the soldier. He looked at the bread, then he looked at her, and then he began to cry again. Marie did not say anything. She simply put her arm around him and held him the way she had held her own sons when they were small and frightened. 2 strangers. 2 people who did not speak the same language, sitting in the ruins of a village that had been torn apart by war. But in that moment, language did not matter. Nationality did not matter. Only human compassion mattered. The young soldier wept, and the old French woman held him, and somewhere in the distance, guns were still firing as the war continued. But here, in this small quiet space, there was peace. James Callahan and the lucky coin. Later that evening, Major Flynn found James Callahan again. The young man was sitting in the corner of a bombed-out church, cleaning his rifle by candlelight. His movements were mechanical. His face was blank. Flynn sat down across from him. For a while, neither man spoke. The candle flickered, casting shadows on the ruined walls. Through the holes in the roof, stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Finally, Flynn broke the silence. "Tell me about your brother." James looked up. His eyes held a question. "I did not know him," Flynn continued. "I saw him fight. I saw him die. But I did not know him. Tell me who he was." James was quiet for a moment. Then slowly he began to speak. Tommy was the best person I ever knew. He was not smart like me. He always said that. But he was good. Really good. The kind of person who would give his last dollar to a stranger. The kind of person who would fight anyone who picked on someone smaller. Flynn nodded, listening. "When I was 12, some older kids were bullying me at school. Tommy was 16. He found out about it and he went to talk to them. I do not know what he said, but they never bothered me again." James turned the silver coin over in his fingers. "He always protected me. Always, even when we were little. If I had a nightmare, he would come into my room and stay until I fell asleep. If I got in trouble with Dad, he would take the blame for me." His voice cracked. "And today he did it again. He stepped in front of me. He took the bullets that were meant for me. He died so I could live." Flynn leaned forward. "Listen to me," he said. "What your brother did today, that was not just instinct. That was love. The deepest kind of love there is. He gave his life for yours because he believed your life was worth more than his." James shook his head. "It was not. We were equals. Brothers." "No," Flynn said firmly. "In his eyes, you were more. He saw something in you, some potential, some future that he wanted to protect. And he was willing to pay any price to make sure you got to live that future." James looked at the coin again. So what do I do now? How do I live with this? Flynn thought about the question. He thought about all the men he had lost at Kasserine, all the men he had lost today, all the ghosts that would follow him for the rest of his life. You carry it, he said finally. You do not try to forget. You do not try to move on. You carry it with you always, and you let it make you better. You live a life worthy of his sacrifice. That is how you honor him. James closed his fist around the coin. I will never forget him, he said quietly. Every day for the rest of my life, I will think about him. Flynn nodded. Good, because that is what immortality really is. Not living forever yourself, but being remembered forever by the people who loved you. As long as you carry his memory, Tommy Callahan will never truly die. James looked at Flynn with something like gratitude in his eyes. Thank you, Major, for saying that, for being here. Flynn stood up and put his hand on the younger man's shoulder. We are brothers now, he said. All of us who survived today. We are bound together by what we have seen and done. And brothers look out for each other. He turned and walked out of the ruined church, leaving James alone with his grief and his memories and the silver coin that would never leave his pocket again 40 years later. June 6, 1984. Normandy, France. The beach was different now. Where once there had been blood and fire and death, now there were tourists and sunbathers and children building castles in the sand. Where once the thunder of guns had shaken the air, now there was only the gentle sound of waves and the laughter of families on holiday. Marcus Flynn stood at the edge of the water and watched the tide come in. He was 72 years old. His hair had turned white. His face was lined with decades of living. But his eyes were still sharp, still carrying the memories of everything he had seen. This was his first time back since the war. For 40 years he had avoided this place. The memories were too painful. The ghosts were too close. But something had drawn him back. Some need to see it one more time before he died. To stand where he had stood on that terrible morning and remember the men who had not grown old. He was lost in thought when a voice spoke behind him. Excuse me, are you Major Flynn, 29th Infantry Division? Flynn turned. An old man was standing there. White hair, weathered face, German accent. Flynn stared at him. Something stirred in his memory. Something from 40 years ago, and then he recognized him. Vogel, he said slowly. Heinrich Vogel. The German nodded. His eyes were wet. You remember me. Flynn could hardly believe it. The German sergeant he had spared. The school teacher from Bavaria. The man who had surrendered his bunker rather than sacrifice his young soldiers. I remember, Flynn said. I never forgot. They stood facing each other for a long moment. Two old men on a beach where they had once been young. Two former enemies who had both survived the war in the decades that followed. Then Vogel spoke again. I have thought about you every day since that morning, every single day. I wanted to find you, to thank you, but I did not know how. Flynn shook his head. You do not need to thank me. I did what was right. No, Vogel said firmly. You did what was extraordinary. You could have killed me. You could have killed all of my men. You had every right. We had been shooting at you all morning. We had killed so many of your soldiers. He paused, struggling with emotion. But you spared us. You showed mercy when mercy seemed impossible. And then your medic, David Cohen, he saved my life. He stitched my wounds and kept me alive when he could have let me die. Flynn remembered. He remembered the chaos of that morning, the rage he had felt, the grenade in his hand ready to throw, and the choice he had made to lower it instead. I was not being noble, Flynn said quietly. I was just tired of killing. Vogel shook his head. You do not understand, he said. That moment changed my life. It changed everything I believed. The propaganda had told us that Americans were barbarians, monsters, that you would show no mercy to capture Germans. He reached out and gripped Flynn's arm. But you did show mercy. You treated us like human beings. You saved my life and the lives of my men. And when I got home to Germany after the war, I told everyone I knew. I told them that the Americans were not monsters. I told them that there was still goodness in the world. Flynn looked at this man who had been his enemy, who had tried to kill him, who had killed so many of his friends. And he saw not an enemy, not a monster, just a man, a teacher, a father, someone who had been caught up in a war he never wanted. What happened to your family? Flynn asked. Your wife and your daughter, Vogel smiled, a real smile, the smile of a man whose story had a happy ending. Marta lived until 1979. We had 50 beautiful years together. Anna became a doctor. She has 3 children now. And Liesel became a teacher like her father. She teaches in the same school where I taught before the war. Flynn felt something loosen in his chest, some knot of tension he had carried for decades. I am glad, he said. I am glad your family was safe. Because of you, Vogel said. Because you gave me the chance to return to them. Because you chose mercy over vengeance on a day when vengeance would have been so easy. They stood in silence for a while watching the waves. Then Vogel reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, old and yellowed, creased from being folded and unfolded thousands of times. This is the letter I was writing to my wife the night before the invasion, he said. I never sent it. I kept it as a reminder of who I was before the war, of the man I wanted to be. Flynn reached into his own pocket. He pulled out a letter just as worn, just as fragile. This is from my mother, he said. She wrote it before she died. She told me to have courage when I faced the gates of hell. 2 letters, 2 men, 2 pieces of paper that had carried them through the worst day of their lives. Perhaps we are more alike than we knew, Vogel said, softly. Flynn nodded. Perhaps that is the lesson, he replied. The lesson of war, that the men on the other side are just men, not monsters, not demons, just human beings trying to survive and get home to the people they love. Vogel was quiet for a moment, then he did something unexpected. He opened his arms and embraced Flynn, and Flynn embraced him back. 2 old men, 2 former enemies, holding each other on the beach where they had tried to kill each other 40 years before. When they finally stepped apart, both of them were crying. Thank you, Vogel said. For my life, for my family, for everything. Flynn wiped his eyes. And thank you, he said, for showing me that even enemies can become brothers. The lesson. They walked together along the beach for hours that afternoon. 2 old soldiers, sharing stories, sharing memories, sharing the burden of all they had seen and done. Vogel told Flynn about the nightmares that had plagued him for years after the war, about the guilt of knowing he had killed so many Americans on that beach, about the long, slow process of forgiving himself. Flynn told Vogel about Kasserine, about the shame that had driven him and his men to fight so hard on D-Day, about the weight of command, the terrible responsibility of ordering men to their deaths. They talked about their families, their careers after the war, the grandchildren who would never understand what their grandfathers had experienced. And they talked about mercy. That moment when you lowered the grenade, Vogel said, that was the moment that changed everything for me. I had been taught that Americans were savages, that you would show no quarter to defeated enemies. And then you showed me that everything I had been taught was a lie. Flynn nodded slowly. I almost did not lower it, he admitted. I was so angry. So many of my men had died. I wanted revenge, but you did lower it. Why? Flynn thought about the question. He had asked himself the same thing many times over the years. Because I remembered who I was, he said finally. Not just a soldier, not just a killer, but a man, a human being. My mother taught me that. She taught me that the true test of character is not how you treat your friends. It is how you treat your enemies. Vogel was silent for a long moment. Then he said, I have tried to live on that lesson ever since. Every day I try to treat people with kindness, with compassion, with the same mercy you showed me on that beach. Flynn smiled. Then something good came out of all that horror, he said. Something worth remembering. 80 years later, June 6, 2024, James Callahan was 101 years old. He sat in a wheelchair on the beach at Normandy, wrapped in blankets against the cool morning air. His daughter and grandson stood behind him, watching over him with concern. This would be his last visit. He knew that. His body was failing. His heart was weak. The doctors had warned him against making the trip. But he had to come, one more time, for Tommy. The beach was crowded with people, tourists, veterans, families of the fallen. They had come from all over the world to mark the 80th anniversary of D-Day. James looked out at the water, at the waves rolling gently onto the sand, at the peaceful scene that gave no hint of the horror that had unfolded here 8 decades ago. In his pocket, he held the silver coin, Tommy's coin. He had carried it every day for 80 years. It was worn smooth now from all the times he had held it, turned it, remembered. A little girl approached him. She was French, maybe 8 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes. She carried a small American flag in her hand. Her mother was with her, gently guiding her forward. The little girl stopped in front of James's wheelchair. She looked up at him with solemn eyes. Then, with careful formality, she placed the flag in his hand. Merci, she said. Thank you. James looked at the flag, at the little girl, at this child who had been born decades after the war in a France that was free because of what he and his brothers had done. His eyes filled with tears. The little girl looked concerned. She turned to her mother and asked something in French. The mother leaned down and translated. She wants to know why you are crying. James wiped his eyes with a trembling hand. Because you remember, he said. After all these years, after all this time, you still remember. The mother translated. The little girl nodded seriously. Then she did something that James would remember for the rest of his days. She stepped forward and kissed him on the cheek, a gesture of gratitude from one generation to another, from a child of freedom to an old man who had paid for that freedom with blood and tears and the life of his brother. James reached out and took the little girl's hand. Your country is beautiful, he said, and free. That is what we fought for. That is what Tommy died for. He looked at the mother. Please tell her that my brother gave his life on this beach so that children like her could grow up without fear. Tell her to live a good life, a happy life. That is all we ever wanted for the next generation. The mother translated. The little girl listened. Then she nodded again with the seriousness of the young who are too innocent to understand death but wise enough to recognize sacrifice. She waved goodbye and walked away with her mother, disappearing into the crowd of visitors. James watched her go. Then he turned to his grandson. Michael, he said, come here. His grandson knelt beside the wheelchair. I want you to have something. James reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver coin. The coin his father had given to Tommy. The coin Tommy had given to him on the night before the landing. The coin he had carried for 80 years. This belonged to your great-uncle Tommy, James said. He died right over there on that beach, saving my life. I have carried this coin ever since. And now I am giving it to you. Michael looked at the coin with reverence. Grandpa, I cannot take this. It is too important. James shook his head. That is exactly why you must take it, he said. Because it is important. Because it carries a story that must never be forgotten. Tommy died so that I could live. So that I could have children and grandchildren. So that you could exist. He pressed the coin into Michael's hand. Carry it. Remember him. And someday when you have children of your own, tell them the story. Tell them about the boys who landed on this beach and gave everything so that the world could be free. Michael held the coin tightly. Tears were running down his face. I will, Grandpa. I promise I will never forget. James nodded. He looked out at the water one more time. The tide was coming in, just as it had on that morning 80 years ago. The water crept up the sand, washing over the ground where so many had died. James closed his eyes. He could almost see them. The ghosts of that morning, young men in olive-drab uniforms running through the surf, falling under the hail of bullets. Flynn standing up and charging forward. Tommy shielding him with his body. I am coming, Tommy, he whispered. Wait for me. I am almost there. Epilogue. James Callahan died on December 15, 2024. He was 101 years old. He passed peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by his daughter and grandchildren. In accordance with his wishes, he was buried at the Normandy American Cemetery in a plot beside his brother Thomas. The two brothers, separated for 80 years, were finally together again. The silver coin was placed between their headstones, connecting them across death as it had connected them across life. On the day of the funeral, more than 1,000 people came to pay their respects. Veterans from later wars, French citizens who remembered what the Americans had done for their country, school children who had learned about D-Day in their history classes. A French girl, now a young woman, stood in the crowd. She had been 8 years old when she gave an American flag to an old man in a wheelchair. Now she was 18 and she had come to say goodbye. She placed a flower on each of the brothers' graves. Merci, she whispered. Thank you for my freedom. The guns have been silent for 80 years now. The bunkers have crumbled. The obstacles have rusted away. The beach where so much blood was spilled is now a place where children play and families vacation. But the memory remains. 340 Americans died in those 47 minutes. 340 sons and brothers and husbands and fathers. They came from farms in Kansas, and factories in Detroit, and fishing boats in Maine. They were young and scared and far from home, and they gave everything, not for glory, not for medals, not for the grand sweep of history that we study in books. They gave everything for each other, for the men beside them in the landing craft, for the brothers who shared their foxholes and their fears, for the idea that some things are worth dying for. Freedom is worth dying for. Mercy is worth dying for. Love is worth dying for. The men of the 29th Infantry Division learned that lesson on a beach in France. They had been called failures. They had been mocked and doubted and written off. But when the moment came, they rose. They charged into the fire and they broke through the wall. And they proved that redemption is always possible for those with the courage to seek it. 47 minutes. That is how long it took to change history. 47 minutes of blood and courage and sacrifice. 47 minutes that gave us the world we live in today. Remember them, honor them, and never forget the price they paid so that we might be free.